In 1552, Henry VIII stripped the monks of Westminster Abbey of a 47-acre walled garden they had tended for 3 centuries and handed the whole of it to a courtier named John Russell. Not a pension, not a gesture, 47 acres in what would become the most valuable square mile in London. For 400 years, that ground grew cabbages, then flowers, then crowds. Today, on that same soil, Chanel, Dior and Mulberry compete for storefronts that command some of the highest retail rents anywhere in Europe, priced by the square foot like bullion. 2 streets away, in the same window of time, tourists were photographing those displays, recorded thefts from the person more than tripled, from 796 cases to 2,806. The flagship stores keep opening. The reviews keep repeating the same 2 words, tourist trap. What happened to the ground between the monks and the muggings is a story about who ends up owning a city centre, and what they let happen to it once the deed is theirs. Chapter 1. The Monk's Garden and the Earl's Inheritance. Before it was a market, before it was a piazza, before it was anything a Londoner would recognise, it was a garden behind a wall, and the wall belonged to God. For 3 centuries, the monks of Westminster Abbey worked 47 acres on the western edge of the city, out past the last houses, where the ground was still soft enough to farm. They grew vegetables there, herbs, roots, cabbages, the plain vegetable matter of a monastic kitchen, tended row by men who had taken vows of poverty and answered to an abbot rather than a king. The parish that grew up around the wall took its name from the plot inside it, the Convent Garden. Say it fast enough, across enough generations, and Convent Garden becomes Covent Garden. Not a coincidence, not a marketing flourish invented centuries later, an actual fossil of the land's first use, still legible in the name on every map. Walk that ground today and the wall is gone, though the boundary it once marked still shows itself in where the streets choose to bend. Then, in 1552, the king reached over the wall. Henry VIII had already broken with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and begun redirecting the church's vast landholdings into the hands of the crown and its favourites. Westminster Abbey lost the garden along with the rest. It did not go to auction, it did not go to the parish. It went whole to a courtier named John Russell. A man not born into that kind of land, but one who had built himself into royal usefulness, one favour at a time. First in minor diplomatic errands abroad, later in the closer, more dangerous work of a royal favourite, the kind of service repaid not in wages but in acreage. 47 acres, walled, cultivated, a short walk from the seat of government, handed to him not as a purchase but as a gift. He would be made Earl of Bedford. The garden was part of the reason why. Russell did not build on it. Not yet. For decades after 1552, the ground kept doing more or less what it had always done, growing things, quietly, while the city around it did not. Fields, kitchen gardens, pasture for grazing animals, pushed steadily outward from the older, denser streets to the east. London in the second half of the 16th century was still a walking city, still compact enough that 47 acres on its edge could sit half idle for a generation without anyone treating that as strange. The Russells held the deed and let the land be what land near a growing city usually is, an asset that does not yet know its own value. What passed from John Russell to his heirs was not just an address, it was a habit of ownership. A second earl succeeded him, then a third, each content to leave the ground as he found it, collecting whatever the fields produced and building nothing on top of them. None of them sold the garden, subdivided it piecemeal, or let it slip back to the church or the crown through some reversal of fortune, as so much confiscated land eventually did. Generation to generation, the title moved and the ground stayed attached to it. A single unbroken thread of family property running through a city that was rebuilding itself, block by block, around a plot that mostly grew cabbages. By the 1620s, London had stopped being a city that could ignore 47 walled acres, a short ride from the palace. The population was climbing, the streets nearest the old centre were filling in, and the man who now held the Bedford title, Francis Russell, the 4th Earl, was not a courtier chasing royal favour the way his ancestor had been. He was a landlord looking at a map, watching the built city creep toward his family's fields, and doing the arithmetic that every landlord eventually does when the ground beneath an old inheritance turns out to be worth more standing empty than it ever was growing food. He said nothing yet. He commissioned nothing yet. But the calculation had already started, and in London, once a nobleman starts doing that kind of arithmetic, the fields do not usually stay fields for long. Chapter 2. The Piazza. By 1630, the arithmetic had produced its answer. Francis Russell would not release his 47 acres to whichever builder offered the readiest money, carving them into the crooked lanes London usually grew instead of planned. He wanted something London had never had. Not a market yard cut from leftover ground, not a row of houses thrown up around a common well, an actual designed square laid out on paper before a single wall rose, its houses standing uniform around an open centre like men called to attention. For a project with no English precedent, he needed an architect who had already stood inside the thing he wanted to build. Inigo Jones was, by then, the King's Surveyor of Works, the Crown's own architect, responsible for every building that needed to carry royal authority in stone or plaster. He was, by general reckoning, the finest architect England possessed, and very nearly the only one. The rest of the trade still worked from guild habit and inherited pattern books, adding a cornice here, a gable there, without ever asking what the whole should look like. Jones had trained in Italy, where the buildings of Palladio and the disciplined squares of Italian cities had taught him a vocabulary no Englishman before him had learned to speak fluently. Proportion, symmetry, the classical orders set down with mathematical restraint. Bedford's 47 acres gave him room for the first time in his career to use all of it at once. Jones did not invent his design from nothing. He drew on a piazza he had seen years earlier in Livorno, on the Tuscan coast, and on the newly finished Place des Vosges in Paris, a square of matched brick houses built for French nobility around an open centre. From these he took the essential move. Uniform facades enclosing a shared void, the houses subordinate to the plan rather than the plan accommodating the houses. He gave the square matched fronts on two sides, a covered arcade to shelter walkers from rain, a church deliberately unlike any other church in London, and a scale no builder in the city had previously dared attempt. Along the north and east sides he ran that arcade, repeated stone arches under which a Londoner could walk dry and see the whole square at once, and locals started calling the covered stretch simply the Piazza, the Italian word for what it was. The name outlasted every more formal one anyone tried to give the square afterward. Between 1631 and 1638, Jones built a church on the square's west side dedicated to St. Paul, and here the commission ran into the one instrument Bedford never relaxed his grip on: money. He wanted the plainest building that could still be called a church, and told Jones as much. He would have, by one account, nothing better than a barn. Jones gave him a barn built like a temple, a single unornamented portico facing the square, austere in a way no other London church attempted, and deliberate in every line of that austerity. It would take 3 more centuries before the building earned its lasting nickname among Londoners, the Actors' Church, a title this history will return to. On the 9th of May, 1662, a naval clerk named Samuel Pepys walked into the piazza and found a crowd already gathered under the arcade. An Italian puppeteer had set up his booth against the arches, working painted marionettes through a knockabout comedy of a jealous husband and a battered wife. And the crowd laughed at the violence, the way crowds laugh at violence performed small enough to be funny. Pepys stood among them, diary habits already turning the afternoon into notes he would write up that night, and called the show worth the watching. He did not know, and had no reason to know, that he was recording the first performance of Punch and Judy that anyone in England thought worth writing down. The puppet booth packed up before evening. The square did not. 8 years later, Charles II would put his signature to a document that had nothing to do with theatre or puppetry or the arcades Jones had built to keep the rain off shoppers who did not yet exist. It concerned the ground itself, what could be sold on it, and by whose permission. The piazza was about to become a market. Chapter 3. The Market Without Walls. The document Charles II signed in 1670 ran to a few hundred words of legal Latin and English, and it granted the Russell family, the Earls, later Dukes of Bedford, the right to hold a market in the piazza 3 days a week. Fruit, vegetables, flowers, sold from whatever stalls and carts the sellers chose to bring. No architect drew plans. No committee specified where the stalls should stand. No permission was required beyond the charter itself. The Bedfords, who now owned both the ground and the income from it, did nothing to formalise what grew there. For nearly 200 years, that absence would define the place. Traders arrived before dawn and set up where the previous day's traders had set up, or somewhere close to it, and the arrangement calcified into custom without ever becoming law. Stalls multiplied, carts blocked carts, awnings sagged toward each other across the gaps between them until the open square Inigo Jones had designed for strolling and standing became a maze of canvas and produce. Not a market with edges, an actual organism, spreading wherever it met no resistance, first across the piazza itself and then into the streets around it. The residents who had once paid to live beside an elegant square now paid to live beside a marketplace, and the difference showed first in the noise, then in the smell, then in who moved out. They moved out in stages, over decades, the way people leave a place that has not changed so much as they have simply stopped wanting it. Taverns opened to serve the porters and carters who worked the market hours, coffee houses opened to serve the tavern's overflow, and lodging houses opened to serve the coffee house's clientele, each trade layering onto the last until the district ran on commerce around the clock. By the middle of the 18th century, the square Jones had built for polite residential life belonged instead to the trade that fed London's stomach and the trades that fed London's appetites after dark. Fashion had moved on. Commerce never closed. One coffee house in particular kept hours no legitimate business needed. Tom King's stood near the piazza and opened its doors the moment the surrounding taverns shut theirs, staying lit until dawn while the rest of Covent Garden went dark. It served no meal worth the name and turned away no customer the night still owed something to. Prostitutes and the men who sought them treated it as a fixed point in an otherwise disordered night, a place to arrange what the street itself could not formalise. The market had built, without anyone planning it, its own after-hours annex. In 1757, that trade acquired something closer to a catalogue. Harris's list of Covent Garden ladies began appearing annually, a pocket-sized directory naming the district's prostitutes one by one, giving addresses, describing faces, figures, specialties, prices, in language that read like a guidebook because that is exactly what it was. It sold an estimated 8,000 copies a year, reprinted edition after edition for close to 4 decades, distributed through the same taverns and coffee houses that fed the market's nightlife. No one signed it. Everyone knew roughly who wrote it. It survived changing hands, changing publishers, and at least one prosecution, before the courts finally suppressed it in 1795. By then, the piazza had earned a name of its own, spoken with the particular mix of relish and disdain the English reserve for places they visit and deny visiting: the Great Square of Venus. The title fit a place where flower girls and fruit sellers worked the same stones as the women Harris catalogued, where a market with no walls had produced a nightlife with no boundaries either. 2 centuries of unplanned growth had turned Jones's Square into something no single authority controlled. Not the Crown, not the Bedfords, not the parish constables who patrolled its edges without much hope of clearing them. The stalls kept spreading, the crowds kept thickening, and by the second decade of the new century, the mess had grown too large, even for a family that had profited from it for 200 years to leave alone. Chapter 4. The Image of the City. The Bedford estate solved the problem the way estates solve problems, with an architect, a contract, and a building that would outlast the complaint. In 1830, Charles Fowler completed a market hall on the piazza, a long neoclassical structure of iron and stone, its colonnades marching in 3 parallel ranges where the open stalls had once sprawled without order. Fruit had a range, flowers had a range, vegetables had their own covered avenue, sheltered from rain for the first time in 2 centuries of trading. Glass would come later, roofing the open colonnades into something closer to the market hall of postcards and photographs. But in 1830 the achievement was simpler than glass, a market that no longer looked like an accident. It did not fix the streets. Fowler's colonnades sat inside a plan laid down in the 1630s, when the piazza's approaches had been cut for pedestrians and carriages of modest number, not for the wagons a produce market required to move tons of cabbage and apples before dawn. The lanes feeding into Covent Garden, Russell Street, King Street, the narrow run of James Street, kept their 17th century widths, while the volume behind them multiplied by the decade. The market had been given a magnificent front door and left with the same alleys it had always had for a spine. No one solved this in 1830. No one would solve it for over 100 years. What the new building did do was give London a single, fixed image of itself. Not the market of a given morning, not the mess of any one Tuesday, but a picture that repeated so often through the century it hardened into shorthand. The flower girls on the steps of St. Paul's Church, working the crowd before the sun cleared the rooftops. Baskets of violets and primroses arranged in their laps like something laid out for inspection. They came from the poorer streets south and east, arrived with the market itself before 4 in the morning, and by 7 had claimed their places on the church's portico. Not inside it, never inside it, but pressed against the stone as close to shelter as they were permitted. The smell of crushed stem and wet flower mixed with the produce smell coming off the colonnades behind them, violets against cabbage leaves, and the combination became, for 2 or 3 generations of Londoners, the smell of Covent Garden itself. Journalists wrote about them. Painters painted them. The image did the work that no reformer managed with the streets. It fixed Covent Garden in the national imagination as a place, not simply a market. By 1913, the image had a name and a plot. George Bernard Shaw set his play Pygmalion on those same steps, opening it in a rainstorm with a flower girl selling violets to a crowd sheltering under St. Paul's portico, while a linguist catalogues her vowels for sport. Shaw did not invent the flower girl of Covent Garden. He inherited her, already a fixture of 80 years of engravings and newspaper sketches, and gave her a name, Eliza Doolittle, and an argument about class, speech, and the manufacture of a lady from a market girl. The play would travel further than Shaw could have arranged for it. Decades on, it would be remade as a musical, My Fair Lady, and the transformation would run in both directions. The market gave the play its heroine, and the play gave the market its permanent legend, so that for the rest of the century, anyone who had never set foot in London could still picture Covent Garden correctly. Purely from a story about a girl selling flowers on its steps. Fowler's Building, meanwhile, kept doing the work it had been built for, indifferent to its own mythology. Wagons came before dawn and left before the theatre crowds arrived. Produce moved through the colonnades in a rhythm that had held since 1830, and the narrow streets around the piazza absorbed it all the way they always had, barely, and by habit. That habit had another half-century in it. What it did not have, and could not have been built to survive, was the internal combustion engine multiplying by the 1,000 across a city that had never stopped growing around a market that had never stopped moving on foot. Chapter 5. The Market at its Limit. The engine did not arrive as an idea, it arrived as a vehicle, and by the 1950s it arrived by the 1,000, exactly as the previous chapter's ledger had promised. The market that Fowler built for barrows and horse-drawn wagons in 1830 now received London's produce by articulated lorry, crates of cauliflower and apples and cut flowers moving off the docks and out of Kent and Lincolnshire in vehicles 40 feet long, feeding not a neighbourhood, but a capital. The tonnage was not decorative. It was the produce supply of several million people funneled nightly through streets laid out for foot traffic and cart traffic and nothing heavier, streets that had not been widened because there had never been a reason to widen them. Fowler's colonnades had absorbed horse carts for a century out of habit. They had no habit for this. By 4 in the morning, the geometry failed on schedule. Lorries backed into Russell Street and Wellington Street and the narrow returns around the piazza, engines running, unable to turn in radii cut for carriages, and unloading began directly onto the pavement because there was nowhere else for the produce to go. Drivers leaned from cabs shouting instructions to porters who had no clear path back into the market hall. Boxes stacked 3 and 4 high along curbstones meant for window shopping, not freight handling. Traffic on the surrounding streets, the Strand's approaches, the roads down from High Holborn, seized for hours at a stretch during the unloading window, not occasionally, but as a fixed feature of the working day. This was not congestion in the ordinary London sense, the kind any city centre absorbed and forgot by noon. This was a 17th century street plan carrying a 20th century industry, and it showed. Parliament noticed what porters and drivers had known for years. In 1961, it passed the Covent Garden Market Act, a piece of legislation with no rhetoric in it, and no ambiguity either. It authorised the Market Authority to relocate the entire wholesale operation to modern premises, purpose-built, outside the historic core. The market had been asked, in effect, whether it could go on being what it was in the place where it had always been, and the answer arrived in statutory form. Relocation was not yet scheduled, relocation was not yet designed, but relocation was now legal, and a market authority does not seek permission to leave a site it intends to keep. That is where the logistics story ends and a different question begins, because the market was not simply a business occupying land, it was the reason the land looked the way it did. 96 acres of Georgian terraces, Victorian market buildings, and streets that had never once been redrawn for modern traffic existed in their inherited form, because a produce market had needed them arranged exactly so, needed the narrow lanes and the covered colonnades and the proximity of everything to everything else. Take the market out, and the case for keeping 96 acres frozen in that shape goes with it. Planners understood this before the wholesalers had packed a single crate. Not a logistics problem, an actual constitutional crisis for the district, the kind that asks not how goods move through a place, but whether the place itself has any further claim to exist as built. 96 acres is not an abstraction. It is theatres and colonnades and the Flower Women's old pitch and every terrace behind the piazza, all of it suddenly available for a different answer than the one 3 centuries had already given. Nobody in 1961 said what that answer would be. Committees were not yet formed to say it, but the question had been asked in the open in an Act of Parliament, in language plain enough for planners to hear it as an opening rather than a formality. And somewhere in the offices where such questions get filed, a clock had started running toward 1970. Chapter 6. The Wrecking Plan. The clock the previous decade had wound now strikes, and 1970 delivers the answer Parliament's language had only gestured toward. The Greater London Council, Conservative-controlled since the elections of 1967, publishes its scheme for the 96 acres, bounded by the Strand along its southern edge, by Aldwych to the east, by High Holborn to the north, by Shaftesbury Avenue to the west, and the document does not hedge. It calls for a hotel. It calls for office towers, plural, stacked where terraces had stood since Georgian ground leases first divided the parish. It calls for a conference complex, and for new roads to serve it, arteries driven through wherever the market's crooked 17th century street plan proved inconvenient to a planner's ruler. This is not a preservation order under discussion. It is a demolition schedule, drafted, costed and ready. Hundreds of buildings fall inside its boundary. Not the market hall alone, still years from the relocation that would empty it. Not the theatres alone. Not the narrow courts where fruit porters had once slept between shifts. But all 3 together, along with every terrace of houses that had stood before the market itself, moved indoors under Fowler's roof in 1830. Some had survived the Blitz by inches. Some had survived simply by being unremarkable enough that no one before 1970 had thought to want the ground beneath them. The GLC's surveyors mark the pre-1830 stock for clearance almost as a matter of course, the way an accountant marks depreciated assets without any evident sense that a building's age might argue for its keeping rather than against it. Resistance organises in a pub. In December 1970, residents of the district gather at the White Hart on Drury Lane, and among them sits Brian Anson, a planner who had until recently drawn his salary from the GLC's own planning department, and had resigned from it that same year in protest at the scheme he was expected to help implement. An insider walking out of the institution that employs him is a rarer thing than a resident objecting to a redevelopment. Residents object on principle, insiders resign on knowledge, and Anson's knowledge of the department's internal reasoning, its timetable, its vulnerabilities, becomes the campaign's first asset. The meeting in the White Hart is not a protest yet. It is closer to a council of war conducted over pints, with a planner who knows exactly which levers the GLC intends to pull. By February 1971, the dispute has left the pub and reached the front pages. London theatres at risk, runs one headline. Revolt in the cities, runs another. And the phrasing alone signals that Fleet Street has stopped treating Covent Garden as a local planning dispute and started treating it as something closer to an uprising. The district's residents include actors between engagements, publishers with offices on Bedford Street, writers who had taken cheap rooms in the area precisely because no one else had wanted them for 2 centuries. These are people practiced at commanding a room and comfortable in front of a camera, and public meetings that might otherwise have drawn 40 people now draw hundreds, with newspapers arriving the next morning carrying photographs of familiar faces standing among market porters and shopkeepers. None of this yet touches the GLC's majority on the council chamber floor. The Conservatives who commissioned the scheme still hold their seats and their votes, still command the authority to proceed exactly as drafted, and a public meeting with well-known faces in the front row changes newspaper coverage before it changes planning law. But an election is scheduled, as elections always are, and somewhere past the noise of February 1971 sits a date that will settle what the meetings and the headlines have only agitated toward. Chapter 7. The victory that empties the square. The date arrives in April 1973, and it does what dates on calendars exist to do. It settles what meetings and headlines and celebrity faces in the front row could only agitate toward. The Greater London Council election returns control to Labour, and with the council goes the majority that has underwritten the 96-acre scheme since 1968. The new administration does not revise the plan, does not trim it, does not send it back for a friendlier elevation or a shorter tower. It orders the developers and the planners to start again from scratch, and a project 5 years in the drafting collapses inside a single resolution. The White Hart campaigners who spent the winter of 1970 arguing in a pub function room now find their argument has become policy. Brian Anson, the planner who had crossed to their side of the table the year before, watches an outcome he helped build arrive by ballot rather than by persuasion. It is not a compromise, it is a cancellation. Confirmation follows from a direction nobody in the piazza controls. Geoffrey Rippon, Secretary of State for the Environment in the National Government, lists more than 200 buildings across Covent Garden for statutory protection. The listing does not ask the council's opinion and does not wait for the council's next scheme. It freezes the terraces, the market building, the theatres, the narrow frontages on Neal Street and Long Acre, against demolition by anyone under any future administration of any party. What the ballot box killed politically, the listing now kills administratively. Two different arms of government, acting on two different timetables, arrive at the same verdict from opposite directions, and the 96-acre scheme is not merely shelved. It is, for practical purposes, unbuildable. None of this touches the market itself, which keeps trading through the reprieve as it has traded through the threat. The porters still load barrows before dawn. The flower sellers still set out under the same colonnade Charles Fowler raised in 1830. But the market has outgrown its home for decades, and outgrowing does not reverse itself because a demolition order has been withdrawn. On November 11, 1974, after more than 3 centuries on the site, the fruit, vegetable and flower trade makes its final move, relocating to a new site at 9 Elms, south of the river. The last barrows leave the piazza, not under threat of bulldozers, but under the plain economics of space, traffic, and refrigeration that no preservation order addresses. The new market opens the following year, 1975, formally by Queen Elizabeth II. The old one, the one Fowler built, the one Anson's campaign fought to save, stands empty the moment the last cart clears the gate. Here the story turns on itself. The campaigners had organised, petitioned, packed public meetings, and won. Not a partial concession, an actual reversal. A scheme killed outright and a neighbourhood spared the fate of 96 acres flattened for towers and a ring road. And what they have inherited is a vacant market hall in the centre of a listed, protected, legally frozen square with no trader, no tenant, no assigned purpose and no date on which one might arrive. Victory against demolition turns out not to be the same instrument as a plan for use. The building survives. What it survives for is not yet decided by anyone, and the absence of an answer sits in the piazza the way the absence of the porter's shouts now sits in the empty colonnade at dawn. A one fight and an unresolved building can occupy the same address at the same time, and for the better part of 2 years, they do. The Greater London Council does not leave the question unattended forever. Behind the frozen listings and the empty stalls, officials at County Hall are already drafting what will become a revised plan for the site, one built around preservation rather than clearance. And inside the market hall itself, past the swept floor and the shuttered stalls, a decision about what the building becomes next is already taking shape, though neither the shape nor the date belongs to this chapter. Both will surface in the years just ahead, when an empty Victorian market hall in the middle of London finds, for the first time since the Porters left, a reason to open its doors again. Chapter 8. The Apple Market. The shape arrives in 1976, 4 years after the Porters left for Nine Elms, and it arrives as a listing. The Greater London Council's revised plan does not clear the square, it inventories it, building by building, and of the 10 structures once marked for demolition, 9 survive the redraft. This is reversal, not compromise. The same council that once endorsed clearance now signs its name beneath the word preservation. Officials at County Hall retire the phrase comprehensive redevelopment and replace it with something closer to conservation, though the empty market hall at the centre of the piazza still has no purpose beyond its own survival. The listing saves the walls. It does not yet fill them. 4 more years pass before it does. In 1980, Charles Fowler's Market Hall, glass roof patched, iron ribs repainted, the long trading floor where porters once stacked crates of cabbages and cut flowers, reopens as the Apple Market. Inside now sit rows of small stalls, leatherwork, hand-thrown pottery, silver jewellery beaten thin by individual craftsmen, furniture stripped and antiques polished for resale. A building raised to feed the capital now exists to entertain it, and no one working the new stalls needs reminding of the difference. The porters' handcarts are gone from the aisles, replaced by browsing tourists moving at the unhurried pace of people with nowhere urgent to be. The transformation is total and, by the standards of the site's own history, almost gentle. Outside the hall, and increasingly inside its open colonnades, another trade organises itself through the decade. Street performance had never left the piazza. It had simply gone unregulated, an accident of open pavement and passing crowds. But by the mid-1980s, the Market Authority assigns its structure, timed pitches, a rota, boundaries chalked or taped onto stone that generations of feet have already worn smooth. A fire eater waits his turn beside a string quartet. A living statue holds its pose through the cold. And under the western portico, where the cobbles dip slightly toward the old flower market wall, a striped canvas booth goes up most afternoons, no taller than a man. A hooked nose and a swazzled voice pitched to carry over the crowd noise. The same corner near enough where a diarist once stood in May and wrote down what he had seen, 3 centuries before anyone thought to license the ground he stood on. The booth does not know its own age. The children circled in front of it do not ask. The pitch simply exists, licensed now, numbered on a schedule, doing on a Tuesday afternoon in 1985 what an unlicensed Italian puppeteer did on a spring evening in 1662, in the same stretch of open ground for the same reason. By the end of the decade, the arithmetic of the district has fully inverted. Covent Garden ranks among the most visited free attractions in London, its pull owed to nothing grand. No palace, no cathedral, no ticketed spectacle, only stalls run by individual traders and performers working an open pitch for whatever coins land in the hat. The flower market is gone. The wholesale trade is gone. What remains is smaller in scale and larger in foot traffic than anything the porters would have recognised as commerce. And it works. Visitors do not come to buy vegetables, they come to watch a market perform itself. That performance runs undisturbed for a generation, long enough that the licensing schedule, the antique stalls, the striped booth under the portico start to look less like a programme and more like a permanent condition of the place. It is not. Ownership of the ground beneath the Apple Market changes hands in the mid-2000s, and the new holder arrives with an appetite the traders inside Fowler's Hall have not yet had reason to measure. Chapter 9. The Landlord. The buyer has a name, and the name is capital and counties, Capco in the shorthand the property pages prefer. And in 2006, it purchases the Covent Garden estate outright, ground and buildings, and the market hall Charles Fowler raised in 1830, all passing under a single corporate deed. Capco is not a market operator. It is not a patron of antique dealers or a custodian of striped booths under a portico. It is a real estate investment trust, and it approaches 90 acres of central London the way any landlord approaches an undervalued asset, as square footage waiting to be repriced. The traders inside Fowler's Hall, still running the licensing arrangement that has held since 1980, do not yet know what that repricing will cost. They are about to find out in pounds per square foot. Capco's arithmetic is department store arithmetic, laid over what had been an open-air craft market. Rents that once ran modest by West End standards begin climbing towards £600 per square foot in the most desirable frontages, a figure that belongs to Bond Street to Sloane Street, not to a covered piazza that sold apples until 1974. At that rate, a shop selling handmade jewellery or second-hand books cannot survive on foot traffic and goodwill. It needs turnover that only a global retail brand can generate. This is not an accident of the market, it is the plan, stated in every rent review, in every lease renewal that arrives with a number nobody in the hall has seen before. The brands that can pay move in. Chanel takes space. Dior follows. Mulberry moves in a few doors down. Charlotte Tilbury opens a flagship in a building that once held stalls selling fruit, then flowers, then whatever a small trader could fit into a licensed pitch under Fowler's roof. 4 names, 4 flagships, and behind each storefront a lease that a market trader could not have signed at any point in the estate's post-1980 history. The buildings do not change. The masonry Fowler designed, the ironwork, the covered walks, all of it remains, cleaned and lit and photographed for property brochures. What changes is who can afford to stand inside it. Capco does not retreat when the wider economy does. The 2009 recession empties commercial property portfolios across London, landlords pulling back on capital spending while retail rents soften, and Capco does the opposite. It keeps investing, keeps building, keeps repositioning the estate as a luxury destination while competitors wait out the downturn. Between 2009 and the mid-2010s, the company put some £540 million into Covent Garden. New retail configurations, refurbished frontages, an estate remade unit by unit into something that reads to a shopper walking up from the tube, as continuous with Bond Street rather than descended from a fruit and vegetable market. £540 million is not a marketing budget. It is a rebuilding, priced like one. The independents go lease by lease, not all at once, which is its own kind of mechanism. No single closure large enough to make headlines, no single year that reads as the year Covent Garden changed. A bookshop's lease comes up and the renewal number is not survivable. A jeweller who has traded from the same stall since the early 1980s is offered terms that assume Chanel-level turnover from a business that has never had it. Each departure is a private negotiation, settled quietly, and each one removes another thread of the identity the market built across the previous quarter century. By the mid-2000s, the traders who defined Covent Garden's post-1980 reputation are, for the most part, gone, priced out by the same rent schedule that filled the market's ground floor with international flagships. Capco owns the estate outright through these years, unchallenged, its rent strategy uncontested by any rival landlord with a stake in the ground beneath the Apple market. That condition holds until 2023, when a name that has never before appeared on a Covent Garden lease is about to appear on the deed itself. Chapter 10. Shaftesbury Capital and the Price of the Piazza. The name is Shaftesbury. On March 6, 2023, Capco completes its merger with the rival landlord whose stake had circled the estate for years without ever crossing onto it, and the combined company takes a new name for its combined ground, Shaftesbury Capital. The portfolio is valued near £4.9 billion. Not a partnership, an actual absorption. Capco's holdings and Shaftesbury's holdings folded into one balance sheet, one set of quarterly reports, one voice at every rent negotiation from Longacre to Neal Street. The new company owns almost all of Covent Garden. It also owns Carnaby Street, Soho, Chinatown, 3 more districts built on the same appetite for footfall, and Heritage Brick, now answering to the same office. By December 2024, the Covent Garden estate alone carries a valuation of £2.7 billion, a figure that would have seemed implausible to the men who assembled the freeholds parcel by parcel across the 1970s. For the traders and performers still working the piazza, the practical change is smaller than the number and larger than they expected. One landlord now sets the terms for nearly every lease in the district, and the tenants who remain describe the sequence in near identical language. A rent review arrives, a survey of comparable rents from the luxury retailers nearby follows, then a renewal offer several times the previous rate lands on the desk. There is no negotiation in the old sense. There is a formula, and the formula only moves in one direction. Westminster City Council opens its own reckoning with the district's oldest export. Between 2023 and 2024, the council runs a public consultation on new licensing rules for street performers, proposing to confine each act and its audience to 5 square meters, to ban amplification, to restrict the props that have defined the Piazza's acts for generations. The Covent Garden Street Performers Association has operated for decades without ever needing a council permit, its pitches governed by custom rather than paperwork. The association warns that the proposed rules could end a performance tradition older than the United States itself, a lineage that reaches back to 1662, long before any council existed to measure a pitch in square meters. It is not an idle comparison. A city that spent 4 centuries letting this happen by custom is now drafting the first form that would require permission. The numbers arrive from a harder ledger. Thefts from the person recorded in the district climb from 796 in 2021 to 2,806 the following year, more than tripling, and tourists remain the preferred target, drawn by the same density of foot traffic and distraction that built the market's fortune in the first place. Pickpocketing figures track the same rise. The piazza that made itself irresistible to the phone camera has made itself equally irresistible to the hand that reaches for it. Online, the visitor reviews converge on a common complaint, 3 variations on the same disappointment. Luxury boutiques staffed more heavily than they are visited, coffee priced like a sit-down meal, and street performers fewer each season, competing for a shrinking number of pitches under rules still being written. The piazza, that once offered spectacle for the price of standing, still now charges by the square metre, in more ways than the council intended. Westminster's consultation remains open as this account is written, its outcome undecided, the 5 square metre proposal neither adopted nor withdrawn. What still hangs unresolved is whether the association's warning proves prophecy or overreaction, whether a tradition 4 centuries deep bends to a permit form or outlasts one more landlord's attempt to measure it. Chapter 11. Inventory of what remains. The answer to Westminster's 5 square metre question arrives before any planning committee delivers its ruling, and it arrives from a different ledger entirely. By early 2025, Shaftesbury Capital reports vacancy across its Covent Garden holdings has fallen below 4%, down from 15% just a year before, a year in which 1 storefront in 7 along the estate stood empty behind paper-covered glass. No consultation outcome changes that number. No landlord waits on a permit form to count receipts. Whatever the Traders Association feared when it warned that 4 centuries of custom could bend to a stall regulation, the estate's own accounts had already rendered a verdict, and the verdict favoured the landlord's arithmetic over the tradition it measured. St Paul's Church still holds the west side of the piazza, its portico unchanged since Inigo Jones judged plainness sufficient for a parish with no money for ornament. 3 centuries after that judgment, the building carries the name Londoners eventually gave it, the Actors' Church, and it still hosts memorial services for figures out of British theatre, their names read aloud under the same unadorned roof Jones raised for a congregation that could not afford a nave. The plainness he intended as economy became, over time, a kind of theatre in its own right, a stage for grief that outlasted every other use the district found for its buildings, standing within walking distance of the West End houses, whose performers it now buries and remembers. The arcaded walkway Jones modelled on the loggia at Livorno runs along the piazza's edge as it has since the 17th century, its columns unbroken, its proportions unaltered by any renovation the estate has undertaken since. What has changed is what stands behind the columns. Georgian townhouses gave way, over generations, to shopfronts, and the shopfronts have given way now to glass-walled flagship stores, luxury brands paying rents calculated by the square foot rather than the household. Where residents once climbed steps to their own front doors, shoppers now pause before displays lit for effect rather than habitation. The arcade Jones built to shelter a residential square now shelters window displays lit around the clock, its covered walk repurposed from passage to showcase without a single stone moved. A few hundred feet from those windows, the Apple Market still trades most mornings, wooden stalls set under the same iron and glass roof that Brian Anson's campaign kept from the wrecking ball half a century earlier. Traders arrange crafts and small goods on tables their predecessors would recognise, the market's rhythm unbroken even as the building around it changed use twice over. Within sight of those stalls, a Chanel flagship prices its goods nearer to Bond Street than to the Crafts Fair. The market opened as the two economies sharing one architectural shell, one a preserved fossil, the other a live transplant. On the piazza's south side, the Jubilee Market remains the one substantial holding still run by its own traders, not by the corporate landlord that owns everything else in view. It is a holdover from an older version of Covent Garden, one where stall holders answered to a market committee rather than an asset manager, and the rest of the district has largely left that arrangement behind. Inside the market building, street performers still audition most mornings for a handful of pitches, competing for slots inside a licensing system built in the 1980s, still drawing crowds for magic and juggling acts passed from one generation of performers to the next. The system holds for now, while the same regulatory reviews that produced Westminster's stall proposal continue to circle the performers' pitches as well. At dusk, the piazza fills with tourists photographing flower stalls arranged beneath the arcades Jones drew on paper in 1630, 4 centuries after monks first kept a garden on this ground. The stalls stand about shoulder height, buckets of colour catching the last low light before the shop fronts switch on for the evening. A busker's guitar carries across the stone, thin and half drowned under the noise of the crowd. The market that once weighed this ground in turnips and cabbage has moved on, and what is left standing is the stage it built, still lit, still charging admission of a kind, no longer for anything that grows from soil. Flowers, for now.